I wrote and got passed the legislation that the uniform school law allowed school districts for the first time in the history of Mississippi to issue their own bonds, have their own bond election, issue their own bonds. And we naturally started doing bond work. I started doing bond work and did the first bond deal with the city of Jackson in 1987 as a result of that. Over the course of the next, I guess from 1986 to 2006, my various law firms, I did a significant amount of public finance work. In fact, I was the head of department at each of the three firms I was in. The supervisory responsibilities over the bond lawyers and the lobbyists, and I engaged in bond work myself. Over 700 bond issues over that period, total amount of over $3 billion.
But when you left Bernini, and what law firm were you then affiliated with, and basically what did you do, and what kind of law did you practice?
At Adams and Reese, I continued to do the same work as public finance and government relations.
For how many years did you do that there?
I did that for 96 to 2003. So however many years, I guess that's 9 years.
And then in the last decade, what has your professional work been?
Well, the last decade, I retired from full-time practice of law about 4 or 5 years ago and have been a real estate developer and urban planner, community development partner. I started at dual track about 13 years ago, working on the King Edward project while I was still practicing law.
So what is the reference among transaction lawyers to a Red Book?
Well, the Red Book, it's the bond buyer's book. It is the Bible of the listing of who is qualified to do bond issues as attorneys, as underwriters, etc. We lawyers in the profession, we said you're in the Red Book. You can't do a bond deal until you get the Red Book. And of course, case 22 is you can't do the Red Book until you've done bond deals. Being in the Red Book is a prerequisite for doing any kind of bond deals for public bodies.
Have you had that status?
Yes, sir.
Over how many years?
Over 2 decades.
Okay. Have you ever been the subject of any proceeding or allegation brought by any bar association?
No.
Have you ever been charged with any crime?
No.
Have you ever been charged, except for this proceeding that brings us here today, with any violation of any public law?
Well, other than misdemeanor traffic tickets, the speeding or I did a rolling red light.
Okay. Other than those, have you ever been charged with any such thing? Have you ever been a part of the leadership of the bar association at the state or national level?
Yes, I spent a lot of my career working with the bar association. Where I was the president of the state young audience, and in 1983, 1984, I was actually president of the young audience of the American Bar Association, which was about a full-time job back then. I served 2 terms on the Mississippi Board of Bar Commissioners. I served in many capacities. Bar work. I was on the executive board of the APA accrediting commission, the list kind of goes on and on. I spent, my family can attest, a lot of time traveling to execute my bar duties. As my law partners would have said, I spent a lot of time working with the bar association.
Okay, do you have in front of you what we've regarded as the respondents' exhibits in this matter?
Yes, sir.
And is the first exhibit a closing or settlement statement dated June 7, 2011?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's look for a moment at that exhibit 1 of the respondents. This has otherwise been put into evidence at this hearing at the request of the Secretary of State, but you recognize this as a closing statement for a real estate purchase on the date it's indicated?
Yes.
What was MLEC on that day?
Meridian Law Enforcement Center, LLC, and it is a company that was, that I formed along with my partner, Jason Boree, who was, the two members were Watkins Development, 75% member, and 3G Realty, Jason Boree's company, 25%.
Okay. And for what purpose did you and Mr. Green form the MLEC?
We formed this in order to redevelop the old Cowboy Money building in Meridian, Mississippi, to turn it into a state-of-the-art police headquarters for the city of Meridian and municipal court.
Okay. As of June of 2011, who or what owned Meridian Law Enforcement Center LLC?
As of this date here,
Yes.
The Meridian Law Enforcement Center.
Okay, who owned that entity?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, Watkins Development owned 75% and 3G Realty owned 25%.
And who was disclosed as, was there an operating agreement, LLC operating agreement that was the subject of MLEC? And who did it indicate was the manager of the MLEC?
Watkins Development was the case.
And who, as of that time, owned Watkins Development LLC?
Well, for many years, my wife, Susan Watkins, owns 51% of Watkins Development, and I own 49%.
Was that the case then?
Yes.
Is that the case now?
Yes.
With respect to this purchase in Meridian in June of 2011, was there any lease agreement or any opportunity to lease this property that was involved in your decision to purchase it on June the 7th of 2011?
Yes, absolutely.
What was the nature of that lease agreement or possible lease agreement?
Well, this was a lease agreement with the city of Meridian for us to do basically a design build, come up to take this property and turn it into a police headquarters. It was a 20-year lease, and without the lease, we obviously would not have done this project.
Okay.
Wouldn't have had any other use for a vacated Cowboy Mahoney building.
Okay, did a lease exist, the lease with the city of Meridian exist at any time during April or May of 2011?
No,
Okay. As of the date going back to the time of April 11 or 12 of 2011, same year, about 2 months earlier, had the city council of Meridian ever voted on authorizing any such lease? Look at what is in Respondent's Exhibit page, or Exhibit 8, please, sir. What does this reflect, if anything, about the time as of which the Meridian Council acted on authority to enter any such lease?
Well, this was the initial action that the Meridian City Council took in order to authorize the mayor to enter into a lease agreement with us contingent on the acquisition of the property.
Okay, and you said first, I want to make clear that we understand what you mean. Had the city council expressed any willingness one way or another to do this before the date of these minutes, and that is April 19 of 2011?
No.
Okay. Have you ever spent any much time in Meridian or otherwise were you familiar before this date in 2011 with who would want what within the city government among elected politicians in Meridian?
Yes, sir. The year before, I was hired by the city to be their master planner and master developer, and the primary mission was to try to redevelop the 3-foot building. And while we were there in the process, we discovered that the police station was so substandard that it was an immediate need that it could not be put on.
Okay. But had the city council of Meridian ever voted on whether or not they want to do this police lease before April 19 of 2011?
No, sir, they didn't. I mean, they had not.
Okay. Did you make any decision about whether or not you wanted to buy the old Cowboy Maloney building in Meridian before you had an indication that the city council would agree to lease the building?
I did make a decision. There's no way I was going to try the building if I didn't have a lease.
Okay.
Would not have, like I said, would not have had enough use for it and a significant investment for a vacant building.
Was any bank loan of any kind involved in your decision to go through with this acquisition of the Cowboy Maloney building in Meridian in June of 2011?
No. We considered that, and one of the problems that we had in having these loans this time, you might remember, federal regulators were tightening credit and tightening regulations for state banks around the country. And the specific area was more stringent standards for appraisals.
Okay. Did you make an effort during the weeks leading up to June 7th of 2011 to get a loan to actually buy the building?
Well, we talked to the local bank, bank president Archie McDonald. He was the one that the city told us to go to the local banks, so we needed to visit with them, to talk with them, and he explained to me that it would take 60 to 90 days for the appraisal to come back. Those are some particular problems that we had.
About when did you discover that you were not going to be able, as a practical matter, to borrow the money to buy the building itself?
Pretty close to the time that we bought the building.
Okay, so relative to June 7th of 2011, about what time did you figure out you were not going to be able to borrow the money to do that?
But we did a week before.
Okay. Did you have any other discussion with, what's the name of the bank that Mr. Archie McDonald was president of?
Citizens National.
Did you have any other discussion with Citizens National Bank about whether or not they were prepared to loan your entity, the NLEC, money to renovate and then do the full projects that would be necessary to then lease to the city of Meridian?
We absolutely had those conversations, and the two requirements that I had before purchasing the property was I had to have a lease from the city to know that I had a deal, and then I had to have a commitment for financing the project. So we had talked with Citizens Bank about doing the acquisition loan, which they said that it was going to take 60 to 90 days. We didn't have time for that, but we did continue to pursue getting a construction loan, and working on that because we weren't going to need the money to fund the construction loan. As long as we had a commitment to fund it, that was going to be okay.
Okay. When did you get when was the first day you got a commitment from that or any other bank to extend a loan for purposes of this project?
Ooh, I'll have to. I think that's in there, Exhibit 14, I believe.
Okay. Let's turn to Exhibit 14. The Respondent's Exhibit 14. What is this?
May the 18th. This is a commitment letter from Citizens National Bank to $3.5 million for construction of the redevelopment and construction of the Meridian Law Enforcement Center.
Okay. Did you have any commitment from any bank to loan you the money to complete this Meridian project, that is, completed a police department headquarters before the date of this Exhibit 14? And it's dated May the 18th, 2011? Did you seek a loan or talk to any other bank about a loan for this venture other than Citizens National Bank? Now, looking still at Exhibit 14, On the second page, the offer from the bank as of May 18 of 2011 to loan the MLEC venture was still contingent on certain things, correct?
That's correct.
One of those was an appraisal that had to be performed by an appraiser approved by the bank, correct?
That is correct.
Had that been done as of May?
No, sir.
The next item was a signed lease agreement between Meridian Law Enforcement Center, LLC, and the City of Meridian. Is that right? On the third page of Exhibit 14? The third page of Exhibit 14. Okay.
Question.
There's a reference to conditions there on the bank's offer.
Oh, correct. Oh, yes, I see.
Tell us whether or not that one of the conditions that the bank placed on its offer to loan money to MLEC for this venture was the condition of a signed lease agreement existing between Meridian LEC and the City of Meridian.
Yes, that was number one and most important.
Did it exist as of May of 2011?
We had
We're going to go through a series. Okay.
My dates are getting a little bit confused here.
Well, let's go through the sequence. Look for a moment at Exhibit 5 in the respondents. Exhibit 5. Now, at the bottom of Exhibit 5, does this reflect an email from R.G. McDonald, the president of Citizens Bank, to Mr. Goree of your firm, dated April 15, 2011. And he's indicated to Mr. Goree, I am anxious to get started with the credit analysis part of our job, so we do not hold up your scheduled start date. I understand you were shooting for early May. I'm just reminding you that I have not yet received the financial information you promised Wednesday that we need to begin our work. We will need a little lead time to get this work done. Thank you, Archie. You see that?
I do.
Okay. Then you indicated to Mr. Goree in a responsive email, guess I better get to work, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. At no time in April of 2011 had you or anybody else on behalf of MLEC filled out a loan application or gotten financial documents to the bank for them to contemplate a loan, correct? Let's look at Exhibit 7. Now, you indicated that as is the bottom half of this page on Exhibit 7, an email from you to Ronnie Walton,
It is.
to which Mr. McDonald is CC. Correct?
Yes.
Now, who was Sherry Berry at that point?
She was the mayor of the city.
And this is April 18, 2011?
Yes.
You indicate to Mr. Walton, in what capacity was Mr. Walton acting?
Ronnie Walton was the city attorney. His job was to review the lease that we've been negotiating with the city.
Okay. It indicates that you're attaching a revised lease document for the Meridian Law Enforcement Center. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, at any time in April of 2011, were the lease terms for a potential lease with the city of Meridian for this Meridian former Cowboy Maloney property, did they exist? Have they been finalized?
They certainly are not final. Nothing is final with these device.
Okay, let me refer you to Exhibit 9. Now, who was Sid Wilkinson during this time?
He was a loan officer for the Citizens National Bank and was in charge of this loan.
Okay. It indicates Mr. Wilkinson, on behalf of the bank, apparently is communicating to Mr. Goree with CCing of Mr. McDonald, his boss, I'm helping Mr. McDonald to put together a loan package for Watkins Development. Do you see that?
Yes.
And he says he noticed some of in the third sentence there, or maybe the second sentence, I noticed that some of the financials Mr. McDonald requested were not included. The items that were missing from Mr. Watkins' financial income statements and balance sheets for 2009 and 2008, Mr. Watkins' complete tax returns for 2008, Mr. Watkins' complete tax returns for 2007. You see that? As of that date in April of 25, you had not yet forwarded to the bank for their consideration those kinds of financial documents. Is that right? On the next page, Mr. Goree is also responding to the bank officer, Mr. McDonald. Thank you so much for your email. Yes, we are anxious to begin a relationship with your bank. Do you see that? Right. Now that's April 15 of 2011. Right. On Exhibit 10, tell us whether or not this involves the continuing revisions on a potential lease for the city of Meridian.
Yes, this is an email from City Attorney Ronnie Walton, who, in reviewing the lease, continued to come up with additional changes and amendments that he would want put in our lease. Continuing negotiations.
Okay, turn to Exhibit 11 for a moment. Mr. Wilkinson is now following up on in April of 28 of that year, and directing a further inquiry to Mr. Goree of your firm. I do not want to be a bother to you, but I am anxiously waiting a response to the email I sent you this past Monday. Do you see that? And then that is with respect to a request for financial documents with which they could give initial consideration to a loan possibility.
That's correct.
And Mr. Goree forwarded that over to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Exhibit 12. Not until May of 2011 did you do what, as this Exhibit 12 demonstrates, with respect to getting the bank in Meridian financial information that they were requesting.
This was, I sent them the financial information for the tax returns and the K-1s that they were reviewing to process the loan.
And then on May 5, Mr. Wilkinson of the bank indicates what to you in response?
He says, thanks, Mr. Watkins.
Okay. Exhibit 13. The date of, in the middle of Exhibit 13, if I didn't say 13, Mr. Walton, the city attorney, on May the 4th is indicating to you, here's the revised lease with revisions highlighted. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, and then later on May 11, about a week later, he's asking you, David, I was asked this morning when the contract would be available for the mayor to sign. What's that a reference to?
It's just the lease agreement with the city of Meridian.
Okay. Exhibit 15, please, sir. It indicates this is an email from Mr. Ed Skipper. Who was that?
He was the finance officer for the city of Meridian.
Okay. Tell us whether or not, from your experience in Meridian, it was necessary or not for Mr. Skipper to analyze and sign off on and agree to any such lease.
Well, Mr. Skipper had been a long time the financial manager for the city of Meridian. The city of Meridian had some challenging financial times with tax base issues and eroding tax base and some overspending on some prior projects from the prior administration that they inherited. So they were really dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's to make sure that and everything was done right. Mr. Skipper had to give approval for just about any kind of expenditures. And we were, because this project was very tight, we were funds to $2.1 million of that $2.5 million that they decided to put in this project.
Okay. And those funds they had seized as a result of criminal actions against drug dealers.
Yes, right.
Not as a result of selling narcotics, but arresting those who were. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Did Mr. Skipper give his approval or his okay to any such Meridian lease prior to May 19 of 2011?
No.
What does he indicate when he makes a reference to $460,000 per year? What is that a reference to, that dollar amount?
Well, that ended up being the amount that the city thought that they could pay for the lease.
Okay. Had they decided on that amount prior to this time? Let's look at Respondent's Exhibit 16, please, sir. On June 1, what happened?
Well, the mayor finally signed the lease. This lease that we've been waiting on and negotiating on back and forth. She finally signed it with all the changes. And this was the first execution of the lease.
Okay.
It was amended several times.
And look at Exhibit 17. Was there a groundbreaking for this venture?
Yes, there was.
And was Mr. Archie McDonald invited along with the mayor and city officials?
Yes, sir. Mr. McDonald was there. All of the city officials were there. A large crowd was there. It was a jubilant.
Okay. And when did that take place?
That's my recollection.
Okay, there's an email near the half bottom referred to. It was communicated on June 6th, and there's a reference to a press conference tomorrow.
Right.
What is your understanding?
The next day, we were having a press conference and a groundbreaking.
Okay. Now, so that would be what day?
That would be June the 7th.
And what's the date, according to Exhibit 1, of your decision to complete to implement the purchase of the property?
June 7th.
Now, at the time you purchased it, was it ready for the police department to move into?
Oh, no.
Okay. But what was the status of that building, and what other uses would it have been useful to you for, except for a lease for the city of Meridian?
We would have no use for it. It was originally built as a program, and then it was converted to a Cowboy Maloney, and then that business was closed down in the last 8 or 10 years. It had been so there's a vacant building, and it's right in the heart of the city's oldest mall, or right next door to the city's oldest mall that has been closed down for 10 or 15 years, and right across the street from the old Sears building that was also closed. So we're talking about a fairly blighted area, very depressed, and no revenue generation for the city.
Okay. Now, what has happened to the building since, and what is it used for now?
Well, the city is now has its state-of-the-art Meridian Police Department headquarters station in that building with room for expansion, and also they have a municipal courtroom where we actually took Judge Lee's walls and chairs and from the old Eastland building, the project I was working on, we took those and put them in the courtroom. So it's a very nice building. It's probably today's the most modern police station in the state.
Okay. Did you, relative to the bank commitment letter that was received dated May 18 of 2011 on Exhibit 14, and the emails that you've shown us with respect to approval by the fiscal officer within Meridian for that lease payment, and the purchase of the property that we see on June 7th, what is your best judgment under oath as to when you made a decision that you were going to go ahead and purchase the old Cowboy Maloney building in Meridian for this purpose?
Not until we made the purchase. We made that decision only after we had the lease and only after we had the commitment for the construction crews.
Okay. And with looking for a moment at Exhibit '16, when did you, and what month did you first have a lease with the city of Meridian?
June 1st was when the city signed the lease, and that's when we were notified that the mayor had signed the lease. So we certainly did not make the decision to go forward before then.
Okay. Let me now ask you, let me refer you to Respondent's Exhibit 2. This is what?
This is the closing memorandum for the Retro Metro MBFC bond.
Okay. As of the date of, reflected on here, April 12th, 2011, had you decided whether you were going to actually spend the money to buy the Meridian building at all?
No, absolutely not. We didn't even know if we were going to do the deal.
Had you decided at what price you might buy it if you did buy it?
No, we're still in negotiations, unknown price. We had no idea.
Okay. Had you decided whether, to the extent that you could come up with a price and would make the decision to buy the building, whether you were going to borrow the money or pay cash?
We have not, certainly not reached that any decision. Wait, premature to make a decision.
Okay. Now, tell us whether or not during April of 2011, you had some meetings about the possibility of this happening in Meridian and whether or not you formed an entity called MLEC LLC.
Yes, we routinely, I guess you could look at the Secretary of State's records, there are lots and lots of LLCs that I formed, and routinely we try to form an LLC before we get too far along in the project, because we got to have the name of the company to put in the leases or to put in the, applications for whatever it is that we're doing. It's a routine issue. Not all of these end up working, but clearly in my business, we try to have separate entities and there are separate partners in some of these deals, and so if we create one as soon as, if we create a new LLC as soon as we know that we're going to be working on something.
Okay. Did you form the entity in April because you knew you already had a deal done and were going to do it, or because you hoped to someday have some deal on some time?
So because I hope that we had no such deal at that time.
Did you know at any time in April of 2011 that you were going to have a deal on any particular terms in Meridian to do this?
We were just hoping.
Look with us for a moment at the amended, if you can be handed a copy of the amended Secretary of State's, the notice of intent on page 7. Paragraphs 20 and 21 and 22. As we understand it, as to paragraph 20, there's an allegation that you failed to disclose Your and Watkins Development's intent to finance the activities of NLEC with the proceeds. That is proceeds of the Retro Metro transaction. And the allegation is that you did this fraudulently on April 11 or 12 of 2011. Did you have an intent on that, either of those dates, to finance the activities of NLEC with the proceeds of the Retro Metro transaction?
Absolutely not.
Did you have any intent in your mind on either of those dates in April to appropriate or convert proceeds from the activities of, for the activities of NLEC, as is alleged in paragraph 21?
Absolutely not.
Okay, in paragraph 22, did you have any, what it calls here, an intent to use and or convert any portion of the proceeds to finance the activities of NLEC during, did you have any such intent on April 11 or April 12 of 2011?
Absolutely not.
Look at Exhibit 22 briefly, please, sir. The Respondent's Exhibit 22. As of June of, as of your understanding or situation, let us say in April of 2011, if you were to buy a building in Meridian 2 months later in June, did you in April have the ability to fund that in any number of ways or only one way?
All kinds of ways, giving loans, paying cash for it, reserves. There were multiple ways. Like I had resources available.
Does Exhibit 22 reflect some of those ways and some of those resources?
Yes.
As of the middle of 2011?
This would have been right in the June, July time period. This would have been substantially accurate at the time.
What was your hope in April of 2011 as to whether you were going to be able to actually borrow the money to buy the building?
Well, I didn't really have any expectations in April, one way or the other.
Look at Exhibit 21, please, sir. Respondent's Exhibit 21. Tell us whether or not there were other projects and other funding issues going on in your professional life in April of 2011 that would be reflected on this earlier list of top 10 projects.
We were very busy. We had dozens and dozens of projects that we were working on. Meridian was only one. We had multiple projects at the Metro Center that we were working on. We were looking at housing and redevelopment, a hotel in the Fondling area, development called Whitney Place. We were working on the Mississippi Valley Title Building to tear that down and build an Indigo Hotel. We were talking to the Jackson Public Schools about relocating all of their administrative offices from downtown on State Street to the Metro Center, and then to do a redevelopment of all the property in the State Street area, which was adjacent to the new federal courthouse that's been built.
At least I'm convinced. I know maybe nobody else. But let's look quickly at Exhibit 20. Does this list also reflect the variety of projects that you had ongoing at one stage or another as of April of 2011? Or some or all of these also actively being pursued during that time?
Yes. I mean, this was a snapshot of some of the projects. We limited this list. I had a master list of probably 100 projects that we had on our wish list. But these were ones that we were actively
refer you back to Exhibit 1, please, sir. Respondent's Exhibit 1. Now, you've described this as the settlement statement for the Meridian property purchase in June of 2011. And I'm going to ask you to look at the lower right corner, and there's a figure there that says that is what in the amount of cash from the buyer of the building, MLEC.
$587,074.34.
Okay. Who or what, to remind us now, who or what owned MLEC, that very party owing that money, or had promised to pay that money as of that day?
But Watkins Development owns 75% and 3G Realty owns 25%.
Okay. Did anyone owe Watkins Development on that date that much money?
Yes.
Or what entity
Well,
was among the entities that owed Watkins Development that day? Would it have involved Retro Metro LLC?
Retro Metro is one of the entities that on that date owed me a lot more than that money.
Okay.
A lot more than $587,000.
Let's look at Exhibit 23, Respondent's Exhibit 23. Now, this is the first time that in your testimony, maybe the first time, that we've mentioned Retro Metro. What is this document, 23?
This is the operating agreement for the company, Retro Metro, that was formed in order to do the Retro Center redevelopment in the city.
Okay. And is there
It names me as the manager personally.
okay, and that's on page what?
Page 3 of the operating agreement.
So what person was authorized by the LLC members through this Exhibit 23 document to be the manager empowered to do the things that describe it?
David Watkins.
Okay, is there a, turn to page 10 of that exhibit. Is there an itemization of the amount of money that different persons had put into this entity in order to be an LLC member as of that time?
Yes, it is. It's the schedule of initial contributions. The total amount was $10,000. My contribution for Watkins Development as a 40% owner was $4,000, and then Mr. Garrett was $1,250. Mr. Corey was $1,250. Mr. Ketchum was $1,500. Sam Bevan was $500. Leroy Walker was $1,200.
Okay, still on Exhibit 23, let's look at pages 11 through 16 and just briefly tell us what those were.
These are the signature pages from each of the members of the LLC acknowledging the acceptance of the operating agreement.
And in that operating agreement, who is charged with taking over the responsibility of being the manager of this LLC?
I am David Watkins.
Now, has Watkins Development LLC, you earlier described that as being owned then and now by you and your wife, Susan, correct?
That's correct.
Has that been maintained, and was it maintained then as a legal entity, an LLC, separate apart from you as an individual?
Yes.
With respect to the Meridian transaction that we see reflected on Exhibit 1 and the amount that you've read off for us of $587,000, how did Watkins Development fund that money on behalf of the MLEC on that date?
Well, Watkins Development was owed money by Retro Metro, and I had the authority under the operating agreement to, in fact, not just the authority, but the obligation to manage, to develop, certainly the authority to handle the finances of the company. The money was owed to me, so I was wearing, one hat as a member of Retro Metro, the managing member of Retro Metro, and wearing another hat as the managing member of Watkins Development.
tell us whether or not each of the three entities you named, Retro Metro, Watkins Development, and Meridian Law Enforcement Center, was what we know as a limited liability company under the laws of Mississippi. Is that right? And I think in evidence is am I right, the operating agreement for at least two out of those three entities?
I think that's correct.
Okay. Tell us whether or not each of the members of each of those LLCs authorized you to act for them during this time.
Yes.
Has any member of those LLCs ever complained that with respect to this period of time you were not authorized in June of 2011 to act for them? Let me refer you to the bank statement that we see in the Secretary of State's exhibits as issue 34, and I'm sorry, I don't know the ultimate.
19.
Thank you. For 19, yes, sir. All right. Now, look try to find, there's a set of pages that say 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3. So
2, 3.
turn with me to the page, that page 3 that indicates the transaction with respect to Meridian. That's the Great Southern National Bank transaction.
Okay.
All right. What was the purpose of this on June 8th, 2011?
Well, it was to pay for the cowboy money property.
Okay. And why did who caused that transaction to happen?
I did.
Okay. If anybody has ever asked you personally whether you were responsible for that transaction, have you ever denied it? Why did you transfer, as this document reflects, why did you transfer this money straight from the Retro Metro account into something called the Great Southern National Bank?
Well, I mean, to be totally candid, I mean, I had a serious time crunch on that day.
Why?
Well, we were getting prepared for the closing on this property. We had very limited time constraints with the seller on when we could close. We knew we were going to have to close in a hurry. And I had asked the law firm in Meridian handling the deal to give me a little advance notice so I could make sure that I could properly transfer funds, and get them to them. And they unfortunately did not give me advance notice and said, "Oh, by the way, they called me and said we need to close today, and you need to wire this money today." And I physically did not have time to do what I ordinarily would have done under the circumstances in a two-step process. And we make draws or make requisition requests for the construction and other items in the Retro Metro project. And it would go into the Retro Metro checking account, and I would draw those funds out into Watkins Development, because Watkins Development was the one responsible for taking care of it. In this particular instance, I physically did not have the time, by short of 24 hours, of taking that money and transferring it to Watkins Development, because I had 2 o'clock cutoff time on the wire transfer. So I just ordered, since the money was owed to me, I just ordered the transfer to be made on my behalf.
did you make the decision to do it that way?
That day.
Okay. Now, can anybody, as a practical matter, looking at that transaction, in all fairness, can anyone who's just looking at the transaction that we see on the bank statement, that exhibit, tell by looking at that record that you were acting in the three different capacities that you mentioned?
I think that you might possibly tell without further information.
Did you create paperwork with yourself that day or on any other day to memorialize that you were acting in all three capacities?
No.
Okay. Did you ever show anyone this record in an attempt to mislead them or represent anything to them as to how many hats you were wearing or how you did the transaction? Did you do this with any intent to show it ever to anybody for any purpose at any time?
No.
Tell us whether or not on that date, however, in your mind, you were acting, was invoking the rights of Watkins Development as you understood them in your mind.
No question about it. I was owed money to Watkins Development. Watkins Development was the managing member of Retro Metro with the responsibility of paying its bills and Watkins, well, David Watkins was the managing member of Retro Metro. And I was the managing member also of Meridian Law Enforcement Center.
Do you know of Mr. Keith Parsons ever to have asked you directly or indirectly to explain to him what you just explained to us, and that is the three hats you were wearing that day?
He's never asked me that question.
If you had had the time, for the reason that you have explained to us, and that is 48 hours of time within which to do two bank transactions rather than one, and have a record of Watkins Development being a part of the transaction on paper, tell us whether or not, in your view, we would even be here, or whether this understanding on Mr. Parsons' part would have ever arisen.
I don't think we would be here today. I think that there wouldn't be any issue.
Did anybody from the Secretary of State's office ever ask you to explain any of this?
No.
Did they ask to interview you?
No.
Is this the first day you've ever had a chance to explain to them what you just explained to us?
Yes, it is.
All right, Exhibit 24 of the respondent's exhibits is what?
This is the development agreement for Retro Metro.
Okay. And look at Exhibit 25 for a moment. We're going to go back to 24, but for a moment. I see this originally reflected an email from you to Jason Burrick. Is that correct?
That's right.
And it reflects that you were enclosing a number of documents for review, correct?
That's right.
Mr. Burrick was among, at that time, the members of the LLC Retro Metro, is that right?
That's right.
And among the documents you were enclosing for him to review is item number 5, development agreement between Retro Metro and Watkins Development.
Yes.
What does that bear relative to, what relationship does that have to the document we see on Exhibit 24?
It is one and the same.
Okay, and in response to that, a gentleman named Sam Begley responded to this, apparently the same email and list. Is that right?
He did. He said,
was Mr. Begley also among the members of the Retro Metro LLC as of that day?
yes.
What was Mr. Begley's response to the
He
documents?
said, great work.
Okay.
That's in the email.
Is Mr. Begley, was he on that day an attorney or not?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
Okay. On Exhibit 26, this reflects what?
Well, I sent an email, the same email that I sent to Jason Gorey, I sent to all the partners, and as you can see from this email, it included the sales contract, it included the work schedule, the construction costs, and the development agreement. It included all the deal points, all all the relevant documents that we were working internally on Retro Metro. I sent that to all of the partners, and I got this response back from Socrates Garrett, and maybe I should just read this. So David, these documents are so confusing to me. I've asked Terry Wallace to represent me in this transaction. Expect a call from him to discuss Garrett Enterprises' responsibilities and commitments and return on investments.
Okay. What is your understanding as a result of that, or otherwise, as to whether Mr. Garrett hired his own lawyer to look into these?
Terry Wallace is a lawyer. Obviously that's what he represented, that he was hiring his lawyer to look at this transaction, and it included all of this text and email. So we talked about it, and I never heard anything else about it other than when everyone closed.
Okay. And with respect to item number 5 in the email to Mr. Garrett, in the reference to development agreement between Retro Metro and Watkins Development, what's the relationship between that and the document we see in Exhibit 24?
It's the same.
Tell us whether or not you disclosed the content of Exhibit 24 to all of the other, as you call, all the other members of the Retro Metro LLC.
Yes, I did.
And did you get any complaints or objections or recommendations or revisions from any of them?
No, I didn't. Well, Howard Catchings sent me a long list of questions. I sent him a written response answering all those questions, and then he said, okay, when do we close? And
Okay.
he was the only person that asked me questions.
With respect to let me hand you a copy of what the Securities Division had indicated was there before the hearing, is there Exhibit 29. And I'm going to ask you, I don't know if it's in evidence. It might be. It's Mr. Begley's letter. Is it in evidence? Okay. Let me ask you to identify it, and if you can, then we'll ask that it be regarded as
In addition to being a member of the LLC, Retro Metro, Mr. Baker is also serving as our corporate counsel, our legal counsel, and this letter is the letter that he wrote as counsel to Retro Metro with respect to the bond proposal.
And was the date of that letter before or after Mr. Begley had told you it was great work on the set of documents to you that included the development agreement? Okay. And what did Mr. Begley say on that document with respect to whether or not Retro Metro had exercised good faith in all of these respects?
The conduct of the parties to the documents from their counsel complies with any requirement of good faith, fair dealing, and conscionability, and without notice or knowledge of any defense against the enforcement of any rights created by or adverse claim to any property or security interest transferred or created by any of the documents.
Okay. Now, did you agree with Mr. Begley's professional view on that, or disagree with it?
Of course, I agree.
Okay. And did his view on that, as expressed in that letter, come before or after he received a copy of the development agreement and responded to you, great work?
It was certainly after he received the development agreement and all the other documents from the documents.
We'll ask that this document be regarded as Exhibit 45 to Respondent's Exhibit 45. It was Secretary of State indicated they were going to offer, didn't, so we just asked that you acknowledge.
How are we going to number this? As your exhibit?
Let me see if I can simplify on the record the mechanics of our exhibit, since I've turned it all around on that. I seem to have been a court reporter. That's exactly what I've done.
Explaining it, yeah.
For the record, respondents offer exhibits 1 through 44 that we've included in this booklet into evidence. A number of them have been authenticated. I don't know if there's an objection to any of them, but we offer them in and then offer this Mr. Begley's letter as exhibit 45. That would complete our exhibits unless there's an objection. It's just
Mr. Hall, or Ms. Bell?
No objection.
How are we going to distinguish this in the record? Since we've got 1 through 20-something.
Well, that will be states.
Okay.
And this will be respondents' exhibits.
And I want to
As
help
far
the
as I'm
record
concerned.
further on that all of the numbers that I've been referring to as respondents' exhibits are the same numbers that they were assigned in the booklet 1 through 44, so there's no distinction there among respondents' exhibit numbers. And this will be 45, or also moved. And since there's no objection, that will unify the records to respondents' exhibits, and that's all we expect to present. Back to exhibit 24. On the page 1, which is physically the second page after the title page of exhibit 24, there's a reference in Article 1 to scope of work. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Now, in section 1.01, Watkins Development is the developers referred to in this agreement, is that right? It indicates that Watkins Development is undertaking the responsibility to oversee and coordinate the total design and construction of the project. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Are all developers willing to take on that responsibility, or is that unusual?
Well, it is fairly unusual. I mean, all these deals are different, and they're just all kinds of different varieties. We were trying to do, we have construction component in our company at the time, and the purpose of that is to try and save money and be more efficient.
Okay. Now, near the bottom of the page numbered 1, it says the developer shall make reasonable efforts to cause the completion of the design and construction of the project in a reasonable manner. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
See that? Who was hired, if anyone, to oversee the actual construction of this project?
I had a gentleman on my staff by the name of Warren Bowen. Mr. Bowen has a long history of commercial construction. Been on the staff at Tulu College in Jackson State in their construction or their property management departments. And he had a commercial license. His company was called renamed Builders Alternative. And we employed him as a part-time employee and part-time consultant, named him as contractor.
Okay. And by whom was he employed?
He was employed by Watkins Development.
Okay, and if he was to be compensated for his work, how would that work, and how did that work vis-a-vis transfers to Watkins Development to pay for construction?
Well, I mean, I had to receive money from Retro Metro.
When you say I, what entity?
I'm sorry, Watkins Development was entitled, well, we were required to develop this project, and that's a pretty significant undertaking. We were required to do the construction and all the other development activities, so there's a fee for that, and fees charged for that. We made requisitions, and the monies came from Watkins Development, and then in turn, Watkins Development paid obligations like to Warren Bowen and other subcontractors.
Okay. And if Mr. Bowen was to be paid, or if subcontractors who he had engaged were to be paid, what entity was going to pay them? And in order for Watkins Development to pay them and discharge its duties to oversee this construction that we see on Exhibit 24, from whom did he expect to get money?
Watkins Development had to get money from Retro Metro, which was the owner of the property.
Okay. Did what we just described, did anybody involved with Retro Metro complain of that arrangement? Would it have surprised anybody that David Watkins was managing member of Watkins Development LLC?
No, sir.
Would it have surprised anybody who, from your dealings and understanding relationship with the other members of Retro Metro LLC, would they have been surprised that it was Watkins Development that was undertaking these duties and over the life of the expected lease with the city of Jackson?
No.
Look at page 2 of Exhibit 24, and that is the numbered page and physically the third page. Now, there's a reference near the bottom of this article, the second paragraph in Article 3 on this page. Owner shall pay developer a mobilization fee in an amount not greater than 25% of the project costs upon the closing of the construction loan to fund the project costs under this agreement. Do you see that language?
Yes, sir.
Okay. When it says upon the closing of the construction loan, what construction loan and what date would that have been referred to?
Upon closing in April of
Tell us whether or not this language was in the same development agreement that was sent to the other principals in Retro Metro as you described.
It's the same language as in
Okay. What is, among developers, there's a more or less typical use of the term mobilization fee. What would that mean?
Well, it's what you're entitled to start up the project. And, you know, it's what I needed for paying me for the insurance, paying for the workers' comp, paying for the rental on the trailers, paying for the equipment that we had to rent, paying for profits that are architects' agreements, paying for all kinds of things. But, you know, in this context, I mean, I was entitled to a mobilization fee of 25% to be payable to Watkins Development or as part of my fee.
Okay. Now, with respect to the closing of the construction loan, tell us whether or not by the time you did the Meridian transaction in June of 2011, tell us whether or not that event had happened already.
The Meridian was much later.
Okay.
2 months later.
All right, sir. Now, did anybody expect all the project costs to actually have been incurred and spent as of the date of the closing back in April of 2011? But what was the date when the mobilization fee vested in Watkins Development?
April 11th.
What amount of construction costs as of April 11, 2011 were expected to be eventually ultimately incurred by Watkins Development on behalf of Retro Metro for this project?
It was $2.5 million. That was our cost of the tenant improvements, our project costs for the building.
Now, that was what you expected as of what date?
As of April
In the construction and the development business, do things always turn out exactly as expected to the penny? Or do sometimes things change?
Things always change.
There have been some general references in the morning to events that took place in later years and months. were there any change orders instituted as a result of activity by the city of Jackson in the later years?
Well, yeah.
Just very briefly, yes or
Okay,
no?
yes.
Okay. Look at Exhibit 43. Tell us whether or not this is the lease agreement with the city of Jackson.
This is the copy of the lease agreement between the city of Jackson and Metro Metro.
Did you have anything to do with negotiating or causing the terms of this agreement to happen?
Absolutely. I worked on this day and night for months. Sam Baker was our liaison with the mayor's office in the city of Jackson, and our attorney, and he obviously spent a lot of time on it as well.
Now, you've mentioned the figure $2.5 million. In your view, what is this provision numbered 10 on page 42? What did it provide for relative to the expected ceiling or budget or cap or amount that you expected as of April of 2011 to be spent on this construction?
$2.5 million was a magic number, and I say that because this was the minimum amount that the city would have to pay. They agreed to $2.5 million, and anything in excess of that, they would pay additional in the lump sum payment. So we were protected. I mean, we negotiated for this provision, and this gave us the additional security that we needed, knowing that sometimes things go wrong in public-private projects, that if there were cost changes or change orders that we had to absorb in the process, then the city would be obligated to pick up those new obligations.
Okay. And tell us whether or not that was your understanding in April of 2011 about this provision that you see on page 42.
Absolutely. That was my understanding the whole time.
In your view, as you read it as a developer and as an erstwhile bond lawyer, is there anything confusing about that $2.5 million figure?
Well, not to me. This was part of the lease. This was a significant term that was included in the lease. It was sent to every single party involved. Obviously, it was a part of the bond documents.
Okay. Now, look at Exhibit 44, the respondent's Exhibit 44.
Exhibit 44 is a copy of an AIA, American Institute of Architects, draw form that basically shows that we had internally we had scheduled a contract price of $2.5 million.
Okay. Now, in your view, as of, let's switch forward to June of 2011, back to Meridian.
Okay.
As of the closing date of the Meridian purchase, did you have a view as to whether or not on that date Watkins Development was or was not entitled to receive a mobilization fee of up to 25% of that $2.5 million construction figure?
Yes, I was entitled to that.
And what, in the development agreement, what is the language about the date as of which you would have been entitled to that, and as to on the date on which that vested?
Yes, the date of the project.
Okay. And had that date happened?
Yes.
Now, what's 25% of $2.5 million?
$625,000.
Had you taken all of that money out back in April?
No.
Look at, I think we've seen earlier the Secretary of State's pleading. You have that in front of you?
Yes, we have.
All right, let's look at that together on page 10. I'm sorry, let's see. No, I mean paragraph 10. Paragraph 10. That would be on page 3 near the bottom of the Secretary of State amended notice of intent. It says the development agreement provided for the developer, Dave Watkins Development, to be paid a flat fee of $500,000 and a mobilization fee of 25% of project cost. However, the project cost is unknown and has not been disclosed. The development agreement did not specify a limit to the project cost, potentially leaving the project cost and thus also the mobilization fee to be paid to Watkins Development without a cap. You see that language?
I do.
Now, tell us whether or not the development agreement itself gave a dollar figure as to what the project costs or the construction costs were going to be.
$2.5
What-
million. That is the development agreement itself.
Is that in the development
No,
agreement?
no,
Okay.
it's not.
Is it in a different document?
Yes, it's in the lease. It is in the lease document.
And tell us whether or not, you heard the testimony this morning, tell us whether or not that lease document was selected by Mr. Parsons to be included in the private placement memorandum and was around the table at the closing in April of 2011.
Yes.
Would it have been, in your view, would it have been apparent to anybody around that table in April of 2011 that a $2.5 million maximum exposure for Retro Metro for construction costs is about $2 million less than the $5 million they were agreeing to put into this?
I think that would have been simple logic, yes, sir.
Did anybody get up around the table and say, wait a minute, where in the world is the rest of this money going to go?
No, sir.
Did anybody say, wait a minute, we need to stop this bond transaction because I or you or any of us haven't reviewed all the contracts through which they might do what we're requiring them to do? Did anybody do that?
No, sir.
Or words to that effect?
No, sir.
Did any of them ask you for anything that would include a development agreement?
No, sir.
Did any of them ask anything about an architect's agreement?
No, sir.
Did any of them ask anything about a copy of a construction contract?
No, sir.
Is paragraph 10 in the Secretary of State's amended notice of intent true or false?
False.
Were you ever asked about that by anybody at the Secretary of State's office, and that is, was there any cap or estimate on construction cost that was effective or knowable by you in June of 2011?
No, sir. I've never been asked by anyone at the Secretary of State's office about this.
Let's look back on Exhibit 24, please, sir, in the development agreement to the reference to the definition of project costs. Now, as you testified, as I understand it, the 25% mobilization fee was to be multiplied times the project costs, correct? Now, were project costs limited to costs and expenses of the project for construction, or did project costs also include, for this purpose, costs and expenses that Watkins Development itself incurred?
Yes, it did include, they were not limited, it included any additional costs.
Okay.
And that's because, for this project, I was a developer, as wearing many hats with my companies. I was also a developer wearing many hats. We had enormous responsibilities for the redevelopment of the Metro City Mall. We were trying to find tenants, we were trying to redevelop a piece of property that nobody else wanted to do. At one time in the premier real estate tax generator for the city of Jackson, and it dwindled to a shadow of its former abilities to pay revenues. We tackled that project. We were looking at every way that we could in order to do development of the second floor, to do the development of the second half of the first floor. We had a dozen people on my staff, and we had architects, engineers, lawyers,
dozen employees of which entity?
Watkins.
Okay. And how many of those dozen employees were working on, perhaps among other projects, on this Metro Center Retro Metro project?
Everybody worked on all the projects. That was my style. I wanted everyone to be at the table to hear about all the projects so that we could have the benefit of all the experience from the different areas with lawyers, and contractors, and accountants, and everybody that we had on the team.
Okay. Tell us whether or not the development agreement included a definition of project costs, as you see in section 2.03, that included ordinary overhead of the developer, including without limitation intended rents for office space and wages and compensation of employees of the developer as utilized for the project.
That is correct. That's section 2.0.
So if there were overhead or compensation as utilized for the Retro Metro project, tell us, and X dollars went toward doing that, tell us whether or not, as the development agreement provided for, Watkins Development was thereby entitled for 25% mobilization fee to be multiplied also against that.
We were entitled to that.
Okay. Tell us whether or not the mobilization fee would also have been multiplied or not against the purchase price for the purchase by Retro Metro of the space from Watkins Development. Yes or no?
No. That's a separate, purchase price was a separate.
Okay. In addition to
Watkins Development.
Okay, in addition to the mobilization fee, was there an additional fee that Watkins Development was entitled to as of April of 2011?
Yes, we were entitled to a development fee of $500,000.
Okay. We need to ask you some questions about the Retro Metro development itself. Who came up with the idea of what became the Retro Metro project, and that is the basic idea of buying and renovating that space for use on a long-term lease basis by the city of Jackson, Mississippi?
Well, that was mine.
Why did you come up with that? On what occasion and for what purpose, in response to what?
Well, Mayor Johnson was the mayor at the time, Mark Johnson, and he had recognized that the Highway 80 corridor in Jackson, which once had been a very successful and commercially successful business area, was in a serious state of decline, stagnation, and blighted, and criminal activity, et cetera. And he had a major initiative to try to do things to rebuild that Highway 80 corridor. He asked me to help in that process and to see if we could spend some resources working the Highway 80 corridor, and obviously the Metro Center is just a pivotal point.
Was the specific idea of renovating it, having private ownership of space, but leasing it to the city of Jackson, was that the mayor's idea, or was that your idea?
That was mine.
Through what, did you tell us whether or not you decided to do that, as if that weren't obvious?
Well, yes, we did decide to do that.
Did anybody else come up to the plate and offer to take the risks and spend money to do that? Anybody else in this city?
No, sir. I went out and got a contract, made an offer on the Belt building for the purpose of trying to help in this redevelopment process, and I was the one at risk, and I was the one who put up that money and came up with the ideas on how to came up with a master redevelopment plan for the entire Metro Center Mall.
Okay, but before you did that, tell us whether or not you and Mayor Johnson went to any meeting or convention or affair related to shopping center redevelopments or developments in order to learn what to do or what you would be willing or able to do about this. At a location west of Vicksburg called Las Vegas,
Yes,
Nevada.
okay.
Did you all go, and
We
what
did.
was the
We
general
did.
purpose of that?
You know, there's an organization called the International Congress of Shopping Centers. And it is a very large organization.
Okay, briefly, who went out there and for what purpose?
I took 3 staff people, the mayor took a couple of 2 or 3 staff people. It was attended by about 40,000 paid registrants, and it's $800 or $900 a person. It is a very, very important trade meeting in which developers and representatives of the bank, representatives of the big boxes, and retail, all the retail chains in the world all go to this one convention.
And what kind of properties was that convention involved in dealing with or making deals with regard to?
All kinds.
Okay.
All kinds.
What's the relationship between shopping centers and the topic of that meeting?
Well, you know, we obviously had a shopping center, Metro Center Mall. The mayor, a little background, I mean, again, the part of this redevelopment of, there's always more than meets the eye. Part of this redevelopment of Metro Center Mall got complicated when the Dillard's building, the Dillard Company decided that they wanted to give that 180,000 square foot building to a nonprofit. And the mayor intervened, realizing that it would be very difficult long-term for any nonprofit in Mississippi to be able to sustain the maintenance and overhead for that kind of facility. So the city bought that building.
When you say that building, you mean the space previously occupied by Dillard?
That's right.
Okay.
And it was vacant. So the mayor was going to Las Vegas to try to see if he couldn't get somebody to help him redevelop the Dillard's building, and also to convince us to, do something with the building.
Okay. But with respect to the Las Vegas meeting and the shopping center convention that you described to us, were there efforts, and we don't need to know who said what to whom, and very briefly, were there efforts made out by you and your staff and by the mayor and his staff to try to interest shopping center developers or redevelopers or persons at that convention in investing in Metro Center and taking their money and their entrepreneurial effort and doing anything of the kind that you ended up doing?
Yeah, we met with dozens. The
Okay.
mayor.
What was the response?
It was negative. It was, well, this was a bad time in the economy, and this was heavy lifting. Basically, we were told that you're going to redevelop, if you're going to have to do something. If you want to successfully redevelop this area, you're going to have to have some kind of public support, some kind of public assistance, which made me start thinking about doing a lease to the city, and actually negotiated with the school district for a long time for the second floor of the building, too.
Okay. Now, who ended up, as a result of all of this activity, who and through what entity ended up buying the Belk building, the space?
Watkins Development.
Okay. And tell us whether or not an entity was formed named Retro Metro to proceed with this project.
It was.
Who formed it?
I did.
Was there any, tell us whether or not any licensed contractor was hired and by whom to contemplate renovation of this space?
Warren Bowen was hired. He was a licensed contractor. Watkins Development hired him.
Okay. With respect to the entering of the responsibilities you've described in the development agreement for Watkins Development, over what period of time were you contemplating that these responsibilities would extend?
So just on the city lease, it would be at least 20 years. And we had, there's a major undertaking.
Okay. What person or company undertook responsibility to get other tenants for other space at the Belk building?
Watkins Development.
tell us whether or not in the closing documents in April of 2011, the bond buyers and other and entities required someone on behalf of Retro Metro to seek out additional tenants whose lease payments could also be assigned to them for
That
repayment.
did happen. They wanted, the bond payments were calculated to be just slightly under what the lease payments from the city would be, so that we knew that the bonds would be paid with some reserve. And there was inflation factor in the lease every 6 years, so that would give us some additional cushion in the outcome.
Okay.
But the bondholders also, just like the typical banks, they just want some additional collateral, and so they asked for security on the entire first floor, even though only half of the first floor, only 60,000 was being used for the city. And then they also wanted us to be responsible for getting leases for the other half of that first floor.
And who or what entity undertook responsibility for getting those, for seeking out those other leases?
Watkins Development.
Let's look, please, sir, at the Secretary of State exhibit that is the loan agreement. It was originally 8, and I don't know what it is now, but if you can
I
reach for
think
it.
it managed to study it.
I think it, bless its heart, I think it did.
What are we looking for?
A loan agreement.
Six.
Here we go. Okay, I have these.
It says Exhibit 6, or look at Exhibit 6, which is a loan agreement between Retro Metro and Mississippi Business Finance Corporation. Do you see that? Okay. On that exhibit, look at page 12, please, sir.
Okay.
And subsection D on page 12 indicates that there is a, well, just generally to introduce us to this, on page 11, there is a list in section 2.2 of representations of company, meaning Retro Metro, is that right? On the next page, 12, on subsection D, see if I'm reading correctly, the promise made in this respect, that there are no pending or to the knowledge of the company threatened actions or proceedings before any court or administrative agency which are likely in any case or in the aggregate to have a material adverse effect, nor is the company aware of any facts or circumstances that would give rise to any such actions or proceedings. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Now, on page 13, under subsection K, there is a reference to, other than any agreements which have been delivered to the issuer and the trustee or the purchaser, the company is not a party to any indenture, agreement, or other instrument materially and adversely affecting its business, properties, assets, liabilities, operations, income, or condition, whether financial or otherwise. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Now, as of that date of this document, in April of 2011, did you have a belief as to whether it was adverse to the interests of Retro Metro to have hired Watkins Development and pay it the fee that was required of it in the development agreement?
Absolutely not. It was, in fact, on the contrary, I mean, it was required that we have the various contracts in order to develop this project. And I couldn't possibly imagine how a contract to develop a project would be adverse on the neighbors.
All right, was Was it your belief in April of 2011 that it was adverse to the capacity of Retro Metro to perform its obligations as landlord and contractor and renovator of the property?
No, sir.
To pay Watkins Development a development fee for, or frankly, to pay contractors or to hire architects or to pay development fees? Was any of that contrary to the purpose of Retro Metro or to its functioning?
Absolutely not.
Look at the bottom of that page 13. Tell us whether or not, in your view, with respect to these documents, Retro Metro was being obligated to make all contracts in its name with all other persons to do all such other things as may be requisite or proper for the proper acquisition, construction, installation, and equipping of the project and fulfillment of the obligations of the company under this agreement. Tell us whether or not, in your view, as a former bond lawyer and then developer, whether or not the parties were obligating Retro Metro to enter contract, whatever contracts it took to get this work done, of construction, renovation, negotiating additional leases, dealing with the city of Jackson, responding to all these variables.
That's exactly what it means, that the purchasers were looking to us to fulfill the mission, and that was to successfully develop this project and to take any and all action and enter into any and all contracts necessary.
In your view, in April of 2011, if Retro Metro discharged the responsibility given to it at the bottom of page 13, was it doing that in entering those contracts to get this work done? Was it acting adversely to its own interests under subsection K at the top of the same page?
No, sir. No, sir.
Was there any contract term in any of these hundreds of pages of closing documents in April of 2011